Hello, everyone. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the RadicalxChange Annual Conference. Our next session will be Changing the Narrative, Valuing Domestic Work in Post-COVID Time. I'll turn it over to you, May, for introductions of you and the panelists and begin our session.
Hello, everyone. I am Maïmonatou Mar. It's really a pleasure for me to be here after the past annual conference. I attended to present my social venture, Gribouilli, empowering French domestic workers. And I was excited to be in this place to talk about those invisible workers. This year have been quite unique with the COVID-19 crisis, which has thrown into sharp relief just how vital the work of the key workers or essential workers is for our lives and survival. And those domestic workers are belonging to this category, and they are disproportionately female migrants and women of color. And these workers who have long been underpaid, overworked, and under-resourced have suddenly become visible and seen as essential. And so we wanted to wonder and to question our narratives about domestic work before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe to share with you what we have learned from this situation and how we can expect that we can maintain and foster the visibility, recognition, and valuation of domestic workers after the pandemic. And also, how can we change the narrative about domestic work to support and to value about 68 million workers worldwide, officially? And how can the new narratives about domestic work can be mobilized to garner public and political support? So to address those questions, we have a panel of 3 experts that will bring their narratives about the topic. And those narratives have 3 different perspectives. So I have a great pleasure to welcome Carlotta Gradin, which is Vice President of Advocacy for UN Women France. And she will be discussing the policy and advocacy narratives about domestic work and women more broadly, based on her advocacy work in the UN Women France. I have also the pleasure to welcome Shani Orgad, Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, and she will be discussing the cultural and media narratives about domestic work and how they are changing. And I will have also the pleasure to be talking during this conversation, as well as the co-founder of Gribouilli's venture of the nannies in Paris region. So together we will share our reflections on these questions, and we will discuss the importance of changing the narrative about domestic work for the sake of our societies. So let's start with one first question that is addressed to Shani, to have a broader context of the narratives about domestic workers before the pandemics. Shani, this is a pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to you.
Thank you so much, May, and thank you for the platform. It's a real honor and pleasure to participate in this virtual international conference. And as you just said, May, I think it's useful to think about the broader context, perhaps before the COVID-19 pandemic, to understand the significance, perhaps, and the potential of this moment. So I want to just give a very brief, if you wish, overview. And where I'd like to start is, I'll share with you my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, one really interesting moment to start with that I'd like is in the movie Dirty Pretty Things. It's an award-winning independent film that's been released back in 2002 already, and it's really offers a gritty depiction of the exploitation of illegal migrants in London. And it centers on these 2 characters. The one is Okwe, who's a Nigerian illegal migrant in London, and he works as a minicab driver by day and as a hotel porter by night. And his friend Senay, who's a Turkish woman, also illegal, and she works as a maid in the hotel. And very briefly, I don't want to do kind of any spoiler. If you haven't seen it, it's an old movie, but worth watching. But Okwe and Senay become embroiled in the underground illegal trade in human organs. And the film really reveals the sinister network of control that relies on keeping asylum seekers and illegal migrants like them desperate to obtain European passports in a state of constant fear. And in one scene, really poignant scene in the film, it takes place in an underground car park. You can see it here. Okwe, who's on the right side of this photo, he delivers a box containing human organs as part of the illegal trade to one of the white British men who are involved in the trade. And you can see him on the left-hand side of the photo. And the British guy, the white British guy, tells him, "How come I've never seen you before? Yeah, I haven't seen you in delivering this stuff before." And Okwe, the Nigerian illegal migrant, in a very calm, quiet, and measured tone, replies, and he says, "We are the people you don't see. We are the ones who drive your cabs, clean your homes, and suck your cocks." So in a very kind of provocative scene, I think what it highlights very much is indeed the invisibility of illegal migrants generally, and many workers who are considered to be low-skilled. I think this whole framing of low-skilled is very problematic, of course, and it serves to justify and normalize their low pay and their very poor conditions. But these are indeed precisely the people that you mentioned, May, part of these estimated 68 million domestic workers around the world, 80% of whom are women, and predominantly women of ethnic minority and migrant workers. So they're doing this vital work that is largely and consistently and systematically, I would say, concealed from the public view. And so pre-pandemic, if we're thinking of the time leading to the pandemic, I think we've started already seeing some changes. In fact, in the very same year that this movie has been released, there was also this movie, kind of a, you know, what's the, Susan Leonard called it the domestic romance films, yeah? Films that are very much centering often around the heroine here, the nanny, who's having a stint as a nanny, and then she's kind of becoming an, you know, mobilized to a more lucrative and rewarding career. And she's, of course, very kind of angelic figure. But we have seen already before the pandemic some more and more stories coming out, less ones that move away from these kind of fantastical romantic depictions. I'm thinking recently about some of the most popular bestsellers from Leila Slimani's Lullaby in the US. It's been marketed as The Perfect Nanny. Recently, Joanne Ramos's The Farm, and even more recently, Kylie Reid's fantastic book, Such a Fun Age. And they all expose indeed the less lucrative aspects of working as a nanny, of working as a baby nurse, as working as a surrogate. I'm thinking also about contemporary shows like Normal People, an adaptation of Sally Rooney's novel, where Lorraine is working as, she's the protagonist's mother, and she works as a cleaner, or Mia in Little Fires Everywhere, which is again an adaptation of Celeste Ng's novel, where she's working as a maid. And of course, how can we not mention Roma? Yeah, one of the important interventions in the last couple of years in relation to the depiction of domestic work. So what these and other texts today really highlight, or start highlighting, is the discrimination and the exploitation that many domestic workers experience, and crucially within a very intricate web of gender and race. Yeah, it's not everyone. And they really echo what Okwe was saying, we are the people you don't see. So it's a kind of a call for action, that we start changing the narrative, that we start seeing them. But I think what is interesting is that even though we've seen more and more of these presentations and representations, they're still far and few between. So I think it would be fair to say that if anyone thinks about when is the last time you've seen a film or a television show or read a book where that centers these domestic workers. Yeah, they are largely still invisible, and of course, not to mention the news as a very important part of this representation. And they are, Nancy Fraser, who's a kind of a feminist political theorist, she describes this as the background condition. These are people who are part of the background condition that facilitates contemporary capitalism, that facilitates work-life balance, and yet are largely and systematically invisible. And I think it's interesting that even in the most well-meaning representations, that's often the case. I'm thinking, just as an example, a few years ago, just in the lead up to the Brexit referendum in here in the UK, there was a campaign, a very, very, well-intended, good campaign by the movement against xenophobia, where these type of posters were plastering UK's underground with faces and stories of migrants to highlight the contribution of migrants to the UK society. But out of 15 posters that were chosen, they included people with professions you can see here, like health nurse, teachers, occupational therapists, a rugby player, journalist. Not one was a domestic worker. Yeah. So despite the fact that proportionally we know that migrants, domestic worker is one of the kind of top sectors that is made up and occupied, particularly by female migrants, they are not represented here. There's something about this invisibility that is very stubborn, as if it would not highlight something that is considered contribution. And it's here exactly, as you said before, that I think the COVID-19 has perhaps disrupted this invisibility, has offered us a rare moment to rethink, where we, in the UK, it was on Thursday. I know in different countries across Europe and elsewhere, it was on different evenings. We all kind of clapped for carers, for key workers, the very notion of key worker or essential worker. Suddenly, these workers have become key and essential. Suddenly, their work and contribution has become visible and recognized. And we started seeing it in reading more and more stories like these stories here that were published in Business Insider, or on the cat stories about nannies, and nannies who had to stay during lockdown with families. And I know, Maya, you have a lot of stories, first-hand stories, perhaps very different stories to the ones we've heard and the narrative we've heard in the media. There was a really interesting heated debate on Twitter here in the UK following Guardian journalist Owen Jones, who wrote that if you can afford carrying on paying for your cleaner, even though she's not coming to clean your house, you should. And this was kind of opened up a heated debate on Twitter about the ethics of employing domestic workers, and about indeed their contribution and about our dependence on them. Grazia very recently ran this story about now that lockdown is being eased here in the UK, elsewhere, how cleaners feel unsafe to go back to work. And even in Norway, really interestingly, I think the Crown Prince himself held a video conference with cleaners and praised and appreciated and said what a critical function they play in society. So this is just really, I think we can think about it as a gradual change in the narrative, and a move perhaps from invisibility to, I wouldn't say to radical visibility, but perhaps to more visibility and more recognition. And it isn't indeed, I think in this context, the pandemic opens up a really interesting and potentially productive, in strange ways, moment to rethink and reevaluate and recognize collectively and publicly the value of domestic workers. Will it be a lasting effect? And what this effect will be, I think, is something we can ponder and reflect on more. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shani, for this background that is really helping to understand all the context and the narrative around domestic work before the COVID and during the crisis. I do think that what we can ask ourselves is, why is it coming visible now? Why do we now recognize the importance of domestic workers? And actually, even some don't really realize that they belong to key workers even now. And what does it mean to have those new narratives today? I will ask Carlota first, maybe to give us some insight about that. And then we can also will add the dimension of gender, of migration, of race that are very important to this question.
Yeah, thank you, May. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation. It's an honor to be here with Professor Shani Orgad and to be here in this international conference. So, can I present in a few words UN Women France? Perfect. So I'm the Vice President of Advocacy of UN Women France, and we are a French non-profit association in France and in the French-speaking countries. And since 2013, I can share with you my screen, so you can see something about us. Wait a minute. Yeah, perfect. Can you see? Yeah, perfect. So as I say, we are a French non-profit association, and since 2013, we support in France and in French-speaking countries UN Women, so the UN Agency for Gender Equality and Women's Economic Empowerment. We have several missions, and in particular, we promote international action and campaign led by UN Women. So, for example, Orange Day, the campaign against violence against women, the movement E4She, and our last campaign is the Generation Equality campaign. We also raise funds to finance programs in nearly 100 countries around the world. And we develop advocacy and awareness raising action. For example, the last one last year was about feminicide. We also act in partnership with associations, academics and companies that working for gender equality. So I invite you to visit our website, but it's in French, so so it's not in English. I agree totally with Shani and you, May, because the world's formal economies and the maintenance of our daily lives are built on the invisible and unpaid labor of women and girls, and most of them are migrants. So government and private sector and workers' representatives have a key role to play in establishing an equitable and gender responsible future of work. So now increasingly relying on digital technology, and this is also lie with social, environmental and economic justice. To give you some data, in France, 88.6% of French domestic workers are women. And May, you know that very well with your organization Gribouilli, and most of them are migrants. So I pick up image of UN Women. So almost every 6th domestic worker in the world is an international migrant. And if I can say my position to this moment, and as Shani said, we are living a special moment with the crisis, but the narrative was changing even before, with the example that that the Professor Organis tell us before. But for me, it's now the moment to change, and I think about our movement E4She and Emma Watson when she said, if not now, when, and if not you, who. And for me it's the same mechanism. So the current crisis could provide a rare chance to disrupt gender stereotypes and show that leadership and decision making should be shared responsibility and build back better and more gender inclusive world. And I see a similarity with the ecological transition. For example, as for the ecological transition, where we believe that we could take advantage of this moment to relaunch the post-crisis economies by choosing, for example, green solution. We have the same paradigm with the informal and domestic care work. So now it's the time to turn the table, and of course it will be very difficult because we are living not only a health crisis but also a deep economic crisis. But if we don't change the paradigm now, at the next epidemic or economic crisis, or with all the problems that are lie with climate change, we will be in the same situation of today and even worse. So May, can I have some time to tell about the UN Women action during COVID, or do you prefer that I speak about this later?
Sure, I think that it's a perfect moment to talk about that.
Okay, perfect. So during the COVID crisis, UN Women suggest action to government, and some of them concerned care and domestic work. So the UN Women Deputy Executive Director, Anita Bhatia, suggests in particular that bailout and stimulus package must include social protection measures that reflect understanding women's special circumstances and recognize the care economy. So, for example, this means ensuring that health insurance benefits for those most in need, and paid and or sick leave for those unable to come to work, for example, because they have to take care of children or elders at home. And also for informal sector employee who constitute the vast majority of the female labor force, as we said earlier. Special efforts should be made to deliver compensatory payments. So first of all, social protection measures, but also compensatory payments. And also UN Women suggest to develop targets women's economic empowerment strategies to explore or even explore cash transfer programming to mitigate the impact of the outbreak and its containment measures, including supporting them to recover and build resilience for future shocks. And I also would like to underline that UN Women lead this suggestion to governments and private sector and also workers representative, but through the UN Women website and From Where I Stand series, we give the voice to domestic workers to make aware not only these actors, so governments and social and private sector, but also people about the situation of these women and their insecurity. So only to present you a person that is in our site, I put a story. So the story of Ana Paula Soares, and it's the classical story of one domestic workers living this crisis because in the East, she lived in the East Timor, and as a domestic worker, and as other friends of hers, so other domestic workers, she lose the only way to only source of income, and with UN Women, this is a way to change the narrative. So give the voice to these domestic workers and care workers to express their self. And now Ana Paula is advocating for domestic workers to get economic support during the crisis. So I invite the people that are see today this conference, to visit the website of UN Women to discover our other people and other account of these very special women that are in front line of COVID. And during the presentation, I will present you other portrait.
I will take advantage to jump in and offer develop more like this narrative from domestic workers and also from their relatives, because I co-founded Gribouilli with my mother, which is a nanny. And so this is not about only domestic workers, but we are talking about more largely social class coming from migration, with migration backgrounds and so on. So I would like maybe to give some insight about what was happening before, what was the narrative. So before the sector, like 20 years ago, and even before, like, was characterized by a lot of informality, and it was not really a big issue as a cohesion between the families that were asking them to take care of their babies and them. There were like really a kind of resilient and local communities with families which were a little bit paternalist and the nannies. So it was not perfect, but it was a very easy narrative for everyone to understand why they were together and why they were in this situation of solidarity. And to put it in a very simple way, and maybe to emphasize this point, what I want to say is that suddenly internet appeared in the sector, and it changed everything, because actually the family started to use a lot internet for everything, including to recruit nannies. So first, in the beginning, it was really going on the online forums, talking about, oh, my experience about having a nanny is like that, is like that. And so what nannies didn't see happen was really the fact that the conversation moved to the communities, local communities, to the virtual forums. And they were not part of that because they suffer from the digital divide. And so this is the moment where they lost control about the narrative. And since this moment, they are really like suffering from this new narrative that is emphasizing the ugly stories, like internet often does actually. And they suffer from an e-reputation that they cannot really criticize, they cannot really enrich, they cannot really also take into account to improve also what they are doing. And so yesterday there was a talk about data colonialism, and it was quite interesting to see that digital divide is not meaning that internet is not having an impact on you. So we see that we can have a e-reputation and a narrative that we don't control. And so since this very moment, there were a new mainstream narrative with a lot of codification. So for instance, it also meant that those parents looking for nannies never had the opportunity really to talk with other parents who had nannies. So they just brought all the codification of the corporate world to recruit nannies. So it was very hard for nannies also, and they had to cope with it. And so it was very confusing because they didn't understood what was happening. I can say that before the COVID crisis, at Gribouilli, at least in Paris region, we started this work actually to have a safe space for nannies to gather, to talk about those topics and to build up a new narrative, which is quite difficult because they need to understand what's happening in the other side, what is the narrative of the other people and why. And so what nannies from our community realize and share our insights today is that before, the narrative was really about the family unit and maybe the little and local community. And it's true that there were trust between the families and the nannies, but also they were suffering from something that was a little bit like invisible also. It was like their work was always diminished. It was always said that being a nanny is quite easy. We don't need any curriculum and things like that. And they always have this critiques that was, okay, but why then it's not attractive to the local people, for instance? And so for them, it was quite obvious that what they were doing was essential, but to the family unit. They knew that they were supporting those families, and very often they will be engaged in overworking and things like that to help the family, the parents and the babies. So it was very obvious for them that there was a sense of essentiality in what they were doing. But now with the COVID-19 crisis, what is really, really changing is that the scale is no longer the family unit, but it's really like the entire society, and even like, I would say like the world, because we see that most of them are migrants and they're also sending money to their families in their home country, and money that is so important actually for those countries that are really relying on this remittance of diaspora. And so what they really learned was that when actually the COVID struck like the country, the activities stopped and they were asked to keep working. And so it was very shocking in a way, but also it was certainly giving credit to what they were saying, that they have a field expertise, they are very important to those families, and that actually the society rely on their work. So what was new, I think, is like the contradiction that they see today during this crisis is we had a lot of policies to protect the people, but they were like quite shocked to not be included in those policies. So I can say that on the health dimension, there were a lot of questions and from the community to understand why they were not at home protected and working in the home of the families, while they often are old people. Actually, they are senior. Most of them have more than 50 years old. They have a lot of comorbidities because actually they don't have common access to health. For instance, you need a visit to the doctor before you start to work normally in France, and often they don't have access to that when they are nannies. And also at the economic level, they didn't have all the policies about short-time working at the very beginning when everybody had that. So it was quite a weird feeling to see that they were essential to the society, but in the same time, they were not a priority actually to help to understand that they are useful to the society, useful to those families, and that we need to support them if we want the society to be in a good shape. So this is like a new narrative that is started right now. So it's moving from a very old narrative that is taking root in domesticity, in gender, migration, and race dimensions that Shani Orgad will develop. But now they really feel like that they are facing their own contradiction, which is like, this is a work that they really love. They really think that they have a mission to help people, to help the families. And at the same time, they see and they understand that the state is not the important protection guard for them, and they have to take some actions. So from a background where they had to be every time tolerant about the situation, every time being adjusting. Now they feel like they need to act and maybe to make some proposal about new policies so that we should not have the situation again. So maybe Shani, you can give us some insight about the dimension of migration.
Yes, thanks. I think, I think you've done a wonderful job. I wouldn't have, much more to add, although I think you're absolutely right that we see here perhaps a conjuncture of two grand narratives. One is about, the migration and the ways in which it's been, in many, many ways, migrants have been othered with a big O, vilified and criminalized. And we have, extensive research that shows disturbing what Asha Min, who's a researcher here in the UK, he calls it a cloud of xenophobia. And a culture, he describes it in terms of a culture of aversion, of kind of, rejecting, almost of a repulsion of the migrant. And I think that's, sadly, we know across the world is, or at least in particular countries, is kind of has become more extreme, and it's in many troubling ways converges with those kind of narratives in the way that domestic workers who are predominantly women of color and migrants are framed. I think the other thing I want to say briefly is that I think it's really interesting what you said about the internet and perhaps more recently about social media as a space where possibly some of these narratives can be or are contested. And I'm currently conducting a very small research with my colleague Kat Higgins about the parenting website in the UK, Mumsnet. And there, what was very apparent is that when the COVID-19 pandemic started, a lot of mothers, many of them are middle class, but not necessarily only, on this website, have really highlighted their dependence on nannies and on cleaners. So it's the absence, it's the forced absence of those domestic workers that has been imposed by the lockdown that is suddenly, and they came on Mumsnet and said, what I've taken for granted for so long is now not there. And it's a moment where actually when you don't have that taken for granted condition, that perhaps has opened up some space for appreciation. But at the same time, I think what we're observing in our study really echoes what you said, is how a lot of, vilification and infantilization of these domestic workers happen. And what you described as naturalizing their work, as if it's like, now what I think what's troubling and where perhaps the hope for me for this narrative to change is that the feminist struggle has been for decades to really make visible this unpaid labor of women, of caring work, of housekeeping, and there's so much talk now about women's equality in the workplace. And this aspect, which is very, very positive, and the He for She campaign that you mentioned, and Emma Watson has been an advocate of this and other aspects. But I think we really need to connect this discussion of women's equality at work and in the public of economic production to women's equality in the home and the unpaid and paid but very low paid often labor of the other women, of the other class of women, of migrants who are doing this work, to facilitate the work-life balance of women and men who go out there, and to facilitate capitalism, really. So unless we connect these two, unless we really fight for gender equality in the workplace, for women to be represented on boards and in the FTSE companies and so on, with the fight of recognizing the labor and the inequality that happens at home, I think this is what the narrative has to do. And this is perhaps an opportunity, because what the pandemic has done is that it suddenly centered and foregrounded home. We were all forced to be at home. It forced us to recognize domesticity and what happens in the domestic space, and to recognize the significance of these people that have for years, for decades, been vital to the smooth operation of our lives at work, because everything at home is being taken care of or is being handled and managed, but was invisible. So that's where I think a lot of what you say, and especially in the context of very troubling and often xenophobic and racist narratives around migration that seem to be spreading now in alarming ways.
Carlotta, where do you see like the opportunity for a long-term change in this narrative?
Thank you, May. First of all, I would like to, I agree totally with Shani, and I share this point of view, and because there is the migration dimension, but also the gender dimension. So the fact that we are a lot of society are in a patriarchal system that discredit women's unpaid work. So if we discredit the unpaid work, and it means domestic work also, and the work of nannies, for example, the impact of the appreciation of this work is very it's a risk, because even if we have not the equality as said by Shani, and we not revaluing this kind of jobs, we are in the same situation as now. And for me, so the narratives, and in the future, we can preserve this. We have to preserve this topic at the agenda, and for example, by communication campaign to sensitize general population and potential employers on domestic workers' rights, and existing legislation, for example, the ILO Domestic Workers Convention and the national legislation, and also support domestic workers as you do, May, with your association, and also enforce employers' awareness by education tools and studies, because as said by Shani, technology have a very huge role in this matter, and I love this kind of question, because technology have bad and positive way. And for example, I see an application in Brazil that connect domestic workers and is very useful for them. But in the other way, we have the problem of cyber exploitation, for example, and the sale of domestic workers on Instagram, and the problem of anonymity, the data protection, etc. So we have to be aware of the danger, but also the opportunity of technologies. And also, I would like to use, you mentioned earlier that the migration dimension is essential. And I had some slide, but I think that it's maybe late to show them. And a lot of money that these migrants, nanny, and domestic workers can be sent back home. And I see that in 2015, the number of international migrants reached 2,044 million, and they sent an estimate of 581.6 billion to their families in their home. So it's huge. And I would also, to conclude, because it's 45, I would like to say that if value domestic work means also to value not only the women's life themselves, but also their children and future generation, because we have to think that this change can reduce violence against women, in particular through the economic empowerment of women. And also this can permit to children to go to school and to have a strong education, prostitution and freeing them from forced marriage, for example, and trafficking of human beings. So reevaluating domestic work can have a domino effect and be a positive push to the all women's and girl life. So not only for category of people, so domestic worker and care workers, but for all women and girls.
I do think that it's very important to understand the change of narrative, to acknowledge that. So for a long time, there have been like talking about what they were doing from the perspective of the impact, positive impact on education, positive impact on the development of their home country and so on. What is true today is like they are taking this narrative about capitalism to directly address this question, saying like we need a win-win deal. So often they will be like thinking that for sure they cannot be paid for what they are doing, because when you trust someone to take care of your kids, then you can ask a paycheck that is quite high, actually. This is a lot of risk, this is a lot of responsibility and so on. And often they like to think that they're raising the future president of the Republic and things like that. And they're very proud of that. So they feel completely engaged in what they are doing, and what they want is really a positive impact for the families and their own families. But today, having this perspective of a more systemic issue with first, yes, like the financial system, the corporate ecosystems, the worker and labor organization and so on, it's changing everything, because now they can see that their contribution is quite important when they gather. And so what is quite interesting, I think, what's happening today in this narration is that they will take this narrative to ask for decent pay, decent conditions. So if we don't have the necessary condition, it means that we cannot take care properly of the kids. We need tools, we need resources to know how to educate a child with disabilities, for instance, and so on and so on. And what they really also need is a decent situation for themselves. And in the context of urbanization, it's quite interesting to see that working conditions are getting worse and worse. They are forced to live further and further from the city and have to commute for 2 hours sometimes to get to the home of the families and so on. So we need also like cities to be engaged and so on. So there are so many questions, it's very complex. And what is important is really to address all those questions and to make sure that at the end they can have a decent life, avoid the disease coming from the work situation, have all the resources also to live decently for them, but for their own kids, and to reduce the inequalities that is just keeping going from generation to generation. So it's very complex as a topic, but I'm quite hopeful that they have the opportunity to take this narrative and to also have solutions to give to others. So this is almost time for us to end. Maybe if Carlota or Shani, you have like something that you would like to share before we end this session.
Well, I'm aware of time, and I think we've had a really interesting and important discussion. You know, to me, the real big question and big hope with the kind of awareness of its dangers is, you know, what happens now after the clap, as it were? We all clapped, you know. I think the after the clap is now the moment to seize, and precisely as you said, May, to also move from the more kind of heroic, sentimental celebration of these workers as individuals to thinking systemically and to thinking structurally about the ways in which domestic work can move from the background condition to the fore, to alongside, you know, other professions and activities and domains of our lives. and not just to appreciate and lionize and celebrate with a salute, but also to translate it into pay, into conditions, into protective measures, into design and thinking about cities, into all these very complex but fundamental structural aspects.
Yeah, 50 minutes, it was really not enough. So thank you, May, to bring this topic